April 14th, 1862. Dawn broke cold over the pine barrens of southern Georgia, casting long shadows through Spanish moss that hung like funeral shrouds. A southern planter named Josiah Caldwell stood on the steps of his plantation house, eyes fixed on the tree line where darkness still clung to the earth. 5 hunters had ridden out the night before, tracking a runaway girl named Zora, a field hand, barely 17, who had disappeared 3 days prior with nothing but the clothes on her back and a rage older than her years. Now, as the first light bled into the sky, only one hunter returned, his horse lathered in sweat, his eyes wide with something that looked less like fear and more like the knowledge of damnation. This was not a simple case of flight and pursuit. Zora was no ordinary fugitive. She was the daughter of a woman Caldwell had sold south 6 years earlier, a sale that ended in the woman's death on a Mississippi cotton farm. The girl had learned of it 3 months back through whispered words carried by travelers along the underground routes, and something inside her had broken or perhaps been forged anew. The 4 missing hunters were not beginners. They were men who had tracked runaways for sport and profit across 3 states, men whose reputations were built on blood and rope. Their disappearance was impossible, their silence unthinkable, and yet the swamps held secrets older than any human cruelty. And Zora had walked into them, not as prey, but as something the land itself seemed to recognize. What followed would become the legend that white men refused to speak aloud and that enslaved people would whisper by firelight for generations, a story of vengeance written in vanishings, of justice delivered not by law but by a girl, who became a ghost, a fury, a myth. Before we descend into those dark pines where 4 hunters met their reckoning, pause here with me. If you believe some debts can only be paid in blood and some stories must be told no matter how dark they run, then stay. Subscribe to witness how history remembers those who refuse to die quietly. Comment below if you've ever heard whispers of Zora's name. Now, let us go back to that morning, to the sole surviving hunter, and to the truth he carried back like a curse. The hunter who returned was named Silas Webb, a lean man of 43 with a face carved by wind and contempt. He had tracked runaways through the Okefenokee, through the dismal swamp, through territories so hostile that even Confederate soldiers refused patrol duty there. His reputation was a currency more valuable than gold in the network of overseers and slave catchers who operated in the shadow economy of human misery. He had never lost a trail. He had never failed to return with his quarry, dead or alive, though he preferred alive, as the pay was better and the suffering more prolonged. But on this morning, as he dismounted in Caldwell's yard, his hands trembled, not from cold, not from exhaustion, from memory. The other 4 hunters had been equally seasoned. Rufus Kane, a former overseer from South Carolina known for using hounds that could track a scent 3 days old. Marcus Trent, who carried a whip braided from bullhide and copper wire, a weapon that had opened the backs of countless men and women. Lloyd Fisher, a German immigrant who had found profitable work in terror, a man who spoke little but whose eyes held the emptiness of someone who had stopped seeing human beings years ago. And Thomas Boyle, the youngest, at 28, eager and cruel in the way of men trying to prove themselves worthy of the company of monsters. These were not men who vanished. These were men who made others vanish. They had left together at dusk the previous day. Following the trail, Zora had deliberately left broken branches, footprints in soft mud, a torn piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush. It was too easy, Webb had said, too clear. But Caldwell had been insistent, his pride wounded by the girl's defiance, his authority questioned by every enslaved person, who now watched him with something new in their eyes, the possibility of refusal. So they rode into the pines as the sun dropped below the horizon, confident and armed, 5 men hunting 1 girl. By midnight, Webb was alone. The separation had happened gradually, then all at once. They had followed Zora's trail deeper into the barrens where the pines grew so thick that twilight arrived hours early and never truly left. The air changed, there grew heavier, older, thick with the smell of black water and rotting vegetation. The dogs, 3 Bluedick hounds that had never failed Rufus Kane before, began to whine, their ears flattened against their skulls. They pulled backward on their leads, straining toward the world they knew, away from whatever lay ahead in the gathering dark. Kane cursed them, kicked one hard in the ribs, but the animals would not be persuaded. Finally, he tied them to a cypress and the 5 men continued on foot. The trail led them to a clearing, where an old slave cabin stood, abandoned decades earlier when the land had been worked by a previous owner, a man whose brutality had been legendary even in a region that measured manhood by capacity for cruelty. The cabin's roof had collapsed inward, vines covered, the walls like veins. And there, hanging from a post driven into the ground, was Zora's dress, the same one witnesses had seen her wearing when she fled. It hung like a shed skin, like an invitation, like a challenge. Marcus Trent approached it first, his copper wire whip coiled at his hip. He reached out to touch the fabric, and that's when they heard it, singing, a woman's voice, low and rhythmic, coming from somewhere in the trees, not words they recognized, not English, something older, carried across the Atlantic in the bellies of ships, preserved in the quarters where white men never walked after dark. Lloyd Fisher spat tobacco juice and said they should burn the cabin, smoke her out if she was hiding nearby. Thomas Boyle agreed, already gathering deadwood. But Rufus Kane held up a hand. The singing had stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse, a silence so complete that even the insects had ceased their evening chorus, as if the world itself was holding its breath. That's when Marcus Trent volunteered to circle around the back of the cabin, to cut off any escape route if the girl was truly inside or near. He was the kind of man who needed to prove his courage constantly, who mistook recklessness for bravery and cruelty for strength. The others nodded, and Trent disappeared into the palmetto scrub that grew dense behind the ruined structure, his boots crunching on dead leaves, his breath visible in the cooling air. They waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. Silas Webb called out Trent's name. No answer. Rufus Kane shouted louder, his voice carrying through the pines with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Still nothing. Just that unnatural silence, broken only by the distant call of a whippoorwill, a sound that folk wisdom claimed was an omen, a bird that sang only when death was near. Lloyd Fisher drew his pistol, a .44 caliber percussion revolver that had taken 3 lives in disputes over cards, and 2 more in the course of his hunting work. He moved toward the back of the cabin, following the path Trent had taken. The others followed, weapons drawn, forming a loose line through the underbrush. They found Trent's hat first, lying in a patch of ferns as if it had been carefully placed there. Then his whip, uncoiled on the ground, the copper wire glinting in the last light. But no Trent. No blood, no signs of struggle, just his belongings, arranged almost ceremonially. And beyond them the swamp opened up, black water reflecting a sky going purple with dusk, cypress knees rising like the bones of the earth itself. Thomas Boyle, the youngest, said what the others were thinking. We should go back. But Rufus Kane wouldn't hear it. His pride was a living thing, fed by every successful hunt, every returned slave, every dollar earned from human suffering. He had never retreated. He had never admitted defeat. And he would not start now. Not because of some girl who probably didn't even know how to load a rifle. So they pressed on, moving along the edge of the swamp, following a path that seemed to appear before them as if the land itself was guiding them deeper. The moon rose full and pale, a bone-white witness hanging in the sky above the canopy. Its light filtered through the Spanish moss in silver threads, casting everything in shades of gray and shadow. They walked single file now, Rufus Kane in front, then Lloyd Fisher, then Thomas Boyle, with Silas Webb bringing up the rear. The water to their left was perfectly still, a black mirror that reflected nothing. Webb found himself watching that water, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching back, not from the trees, not from the darkness ahead, but from beneath the surface, something patient and hungry and old. He had grown up on stories his grandmother told, a woman who had been born in the islands and who knew things the church said were sinful to know. She had spoken of spirits that lived in water and wood, of debts that could be called due, of justice that didn't wait for heaven. Lloyd Fisher stopped suddenly, holding up his fist. Ahead, perhaps 30 yards, distant, a figure stood at the water's edge, too tall to be the girl, too still to be alive. They approached cautiously, weapons raised, and as they drew closer the moonlight revealed what it was. Thomas Boyle, standing ankle-deep in the swamp, his back to them, perfectly motionless. Kane called. His name. Boyle didn't turn, didn't move, didn't acknowledge their presence in any way. Fisher moved forward, reached out to grab Boyle's shoulder, and the moment his hand made contact, Boyle collapsed forward into the water like a puppet with cut strings. He sank without a sound, without struggle, and when Fisher dragged him back onto the shore, the young man's eyes were open but empty, his mouth slack, his skin already cold. There were no marks on him, no wounds, no explanation. He was simply gone, his body a vacant house from which the tenant had fled. Rufus Kane stumbled, backward, his confidence fracturing for the first time in 20 years of hunting human beings. Lloyd Fisher checked Boyle's pulse, his neck, pressed an ear to his chest. Nothing. The German looked up at the others, his face pale, and said in his thick accent, "His heart, it just stopped." That's when they heard her voice again, not singing this time, but speaking, clear, close, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the swamp itself had learned human language. "You came looking for me," Zora said. Her words carried on a wind that shouldn't exist in this sheltered place. "Now you found me." Lloyd Fisher spun in a circle, his pistol raised, his finger tight on the trigger. Rufus Kane backed toward the path they'd come from, his eyes scanning the darkness between the trees. Silas Webb stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs had turned to stone. The voice came again, softer now, almost tender. "Did you think I came here to hide? Did you think I was afraid?" A shape moved in the peripheral vision of all three men simultaneously, a flicker of motion between the cypress trees, there and gone so quickly they couldn't be certain they'd seen anything at all. Fisher fired his pistol at the movement. The crack of gunfire shattered the silence, and for a moment the normal sounds of the swamp returned. Insects, a distant owl, water lapping against roots. Then the silence crashed back down, heavier than before, and they heard footsteps, not running, walking, deliberate, measured, coming closer. Lloyd Fisher fumbled with his powder flask, hands shaking as he tried to reload. Rufus Kane grabbed his arm and hissed, "We go. Now. Together." They began to move back the way they'd come, leaving Boyle's body where it lay, leaving Marcus Trent's belongings scattered in the ferns, leaving all pretense of the hunt behind. But the path had changed. The landmarks they'd passed on the way in the lightning-struck pine, the fallen log shaped like a reclining man, the cluster of palmettos were gone, or rearranged, or never existed. They were lost. Three men who had tracked escaped slaves through wilderness for years, suddenly lost in a stretch of swamp, no more than 2 miles from Caldwell's plantation. The impossibility of it didn't matter. The terror of it did. Lloyd Fisher broke first. The German had survived 3 years of hunting in the most hostile territories of the South, had faced down armed men and wild animals without flinching. But this formless, sourceless dread unmade him. He tore away from the others and ran, crashing through the undergrowth with all the grace of a panicked animal. Kane shouted after him, but Fisher was beyond hearing, beyond reason, consumed by the primal need to escape. His footsteps grew fainter, swallowed by distance and vegetation, and then there was a sound, not a scream, exactly, but something closer to a gasp of profound surprise. The kind of sound a man makes when he discovers that everything he believed about the world was wrong. Then nothing. Just the silence, pressing in from all sides like a physical weight. Rufus Kane stood in the moonlight, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his legendary composure shattered completely. He was alone, now except for Silas Webb, and Webb could see in the older man's eyes that Kane knew with the certainty of the condemned, that he would not leave this swamp alive. "She's just a girl," Kane whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice, only the desperate recitation of a fact that no longer seemed to matter. "She's just a goddamn girl." Webb said nothing. What was there to say? That some people carried more than rage? That the land remembered blood spilled upon it? That certain debts accumulated interest across generations until the bill came due all at once? Zora stepped out, from behind a massive cypress, not 10 feet from where they stood. She was barefoot, wearing clothes that hadn't been hers when she fled rough homespun that looked older than slavery itself, fabric that might have been worn by those who had walked these swamps long before white men claimed ownership of soil and souls. In her right hand she carried something that gleamed in the moonlight, a straight razor, its blade open, its edge catching the silver light like a sliver of the moon itself had been forged into steel. She looked different than the girl they'd been hunting. Taller, somehow, though that was impossible. Her eyes held depths that shouldn't exist in someone 17 years old, ages layered upon ages, griefs compounded across centuries, a fury refined into something approaching divinity. When she spoke, her voice was steady, almost gentle, the way a mother might speak to a child being put to bed. You sold my mama south. You remember that, Mr. Kane? You were the one who brought the buyer to Caldwell's door. You shook hands on the price. $60 for a woman who had borne 3 children, who had worked those fields since she was 6 years old, who had never once raised her hand in defiance. Kane's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His pistol hung useless at his side, his arm refusing the command to raise it. She died in Mississippi, Zora continued, taking a single step forward. Worked to death in the Delta mud, cotton fields that stretched to the horizon. She lasted 4 months. 4 months after you sold her to a man who was known everyone knew, Mr. Kane, for working his slaves until they dropped. You knew. You didn't care. $60 was $60. Another step. The razor in her hand didn't waver. I found out, 3 months ago. A freedman passing through told me he'd been on that same plantation, seen her buried in an unmarked grave with 30 others, bodies stacked like cordwood because the ground was too wet to dig separate holes. The rage that had driven Zora into these woods wasn't hot, it was cold, ancient, patient. It was the rage of every mother stolen, every child sold, every back broken under the lash, every dream murdered in the cradle. It was rage that had fermented in the dark places of the American soul until it became something else entirely. Reckoning. I didn't run from you, she said, now close enough that Kane could see his own reflection in her eyes. I led you here. This swamp knows its own. It protects its own. And you, Mr. Kane, you stopped being human a long time ago. Rufus Kane finally found his voice, though it came out as a broken thing, a plea, disguised as defiance. You can't, there are laws, your property. The words were ash in his mouth even as he spoke them. The absurdity of appealing to law in a place where law had never existed, where the only justice was the justice carved out by those willing to take it. Zora smiled, and it was the saddest smile Silas Webb had ever seen. Sad because it contained no hope, no mercy, no belief that the world could be anything other than what it had proven itself to be. Property, she repeated, as if tasting the word, testing its weight. My mama was property. I was property. These hands that planted your tobacco, picked your cotton, cooked your food, raised your children property. This body you thought you could sell or keep or break according to your needs property. She raised the razor, and the moonlight ran along its edge like liquid silver. But property doesn't think, Mr. Kane. Property doesn't remember. Property doesn't learn the old ways from women who whisper in the quarters after dark. Women who remember Africa, who remember gods that never bowed to your Christ, who know how to call on things that sleep in deep water and dark earth. Kane tried to step backward, but his feet wouldn't move, as if roots had grown up through his boots, anchoring him to the spot. Webb watched, unable to intervene, unable even to turn away, held in place by something that felt like the hand of history itself pressing down on his shoulder. This swamp has teeth, Mr. Kane. It's been hungry a long time, and I promised it 4 men who thought they owned the world, 4 men who'd caused enough suffering to feed something ancient and angry and patient. Zora moved then, fast as a snake strike, and the razor opened Kane's throat in a single, practiced motion. No hesitation, no remorse, just the work that needed doing. Done. He fell to his knees, then forward onto his face, his blood black in the moonlight, soaking into earth that had drunk so much blood already it barely registered one more offering. Silas Webb remained standing, every muscle locked, waiting for the razor to find his throat next. But Zora turned to face him and shook her head slowly, deliberately. Not you, she said, and her voice carried a different quality now, not mercy exactly, but purpose. You're going to walk out of here, Mr. Webb. You're going to go back to Caldwell's plantation, and you're going to tell him what happened. Tell him about Marcus Trent, about Thomas Boyle, about Lloyd Fisher, about Rufus Kane. Tell him their blood fed the swamp. Tell him I'm not running anymore. She wiped the razor clean on her sleeve, the gesture casual, practiced, as if she'd done this 100 times before. Perhaps, Webb thought with a shudder, she had in dreams, in visions, in the rehearsals that rage performs in the mind before it manifests in flesh. But more than that, Zora continued, stepping over Kane's body without looking down, You're going to tell every slave catcher, every overseer, every man who makes his living from human misery, tell them there's a girl in the Georgia swamps who doesn't run anymore. Tell them she's waiting. Tell them the land itself has chosen a side, and it's not theirs." She gestured toward the permis path, and Webb saw it clearly now, illuminated by moonlight, the way out suddenly obvious where moments before there had been only trackless wilderness. "Go now, while you still can, before the swamp changes its mind about you." Webb didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled backward, then turned, and ran, his legs finally obeying him, carrying him away from that clearing, from Zora's unwavering gaze, from the body of Rufus Cain leaking into the black water. He ran without looking back, branches whipping his face, roots trying to trip him, the swamp itself seeming reluctant to let him go. But he was being allowed to leave. He understood that, not saved, but chosen as a messenger, a witness, a warning carried on two legs back to the world of men who believed they controlled everything. He ran for what felt like hours but was probably minutes, time having lost all reliable meaning, in that place where the rules of the ordinary world seemed suspended. When he finally broke free of the tree line, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that deep blue that comes just before dawn, and he could see Caldwell's plantation house in the distance, its white columns ghostly in the pre-dawn gloom. His horse was exactly where he'd left it, still tethered, though the animal shied away from him as he approached, nostrils flaring as if it could smell the swamp on him, smell the death, smell something that marked him as other now, changed, contaminated by proximity to things that civilized people pretended didn't exist. The ride back to the main house took 15 minutes. In that time, Webb's mind worked frantically, trying to construct a narrative that would make sense, that would satisfy Caldwell's questions, that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a man who'd lost his sanity in the dark. But every version he rehearsed sounded insane, because the truth was insane, or at least incompatible with the worldview that men like Caldwell had built their empires upon. How do you tell a plantation owner that the land itself had turned against him? That a teenage girl had become something more than human, or perhaps had always been more than human and had simply stopped pretending otherwise? That 4 experienced hunters had been erased from existence by forces that predated cotton, predated slavery, predated the very concept of property? By the time Webb dismounted in Caldwell's yard, the sun was bleeding over the horizon, turning the sky red and gold, beautiful and indifferent. Enslaved people were already moving toward the fields, their bodies bent by decades of forced labor, their faces carefully blank, but Webb caught some of them looking toward the swamp, and in their eyes he saw something he'd never noticed before, or perhaps had trained himself not to see. Knowledge. They knew. They had always known. The swamp kept its secrets from white men, but not from those who had learned to survive by understanding what white men refused to acknowledge. Josiah Caldwell stood on his porch as Webb approached, his face carved from rage and impatience, a man accustomed to having the world bend to his will and finding it suddenly, inexplicably resistant. "Where are the others?" he demanded before Webb had even fully dismounted. "Where is the girl?" Webb opened his mouth and found his throat dry, his tongue thick. He'd faced armed men, wild animals, storms that had torn trees from the ground, but nothing had prepared him for this moment, the moment of telling a man who believed himself a god in his own domain that his authority ended at the tree line, that there were powers in this world he could neither buy nor break. "Dead," Webb finally managed. "Trent, Fisher, Boyle, Kane, all dead." The words fell like stones into still water. Caldwell's face went through a series of rapid transformations: disbelief, rage, calculation, and finally something that might have been fear, though it was quickly masked. "Explain," he said, his voice cold, controlled, the voice of a man who has learned to rule by never showing weakness. So Webb told him. He told him about the cabin, about the singing, about the men, disappearing one by one. He told him about Zora stepping from the shadows with a razor in her hand and centuries of grief in her eyes. He told him about Rufus Cain bleeding out in the moonlight while the swamp drank his blood like sacrament. Caldwell listened without interruption, his face growing paler with each sentence. When Webb finished, silence stretched between them, broken only by the morning sounds of the plantation waking to another day of brutal routine. Finally, Caldwell spoke, and his voice was different now, smaller, tinged with something Webb had never heard from him before: uncertainty. "You're telling me a girl, one girl, unarmed, untrained, Killed 4 of the best hunters in Georgia? Webb met his eyes and spoke the only truth that mattered. No, sir. I'm telling you the swamp killed them. She just showed it where to bite. Before we descend into what happened next, into the legend that would be born from blood and moonlight, I need you to understand something. This story, Zora's story, is one of thousands that were never written down, never commemorated, never taught in schoolrooms where children learn sanitized versions of history. It exists in the spaces between official records, in the silences that white historians mistook for absence. If you believe these stories matter, that they deserve to be told and remembered and passed down, then subscribe now. Join those who refuse to let these voices be swallowed by time. Comment below with the names of those in your own family history who resisted, who fought back, who said no when the world demanded yes. Share this with someone who needs to know that even in the darkest times, there were those who would not be broken, who turned their rage into reckoning, who became more than what their oppressors could imagine. Now, let us return to that April morning in 1862, to what Josiah Caldwell did next, and to how a girl became a ghost, became a legend. Caldwell did what men like him always did when faced with something that threatened the foundation of their world. He denied it, rationalized it, and then tried to destroy it with overwhelming force. By noon that same day, he had assembled a party of 20 men overseers from neighboring plantations, poor whites who supplemented their meager incomes by hunting runaways, a Confederate militia captain on leave who brought 6 soldiers with him. They were armed with rifles, pistols, torches, and the absolute conviction that no slave, no matter how cunning or fortunate, could stand against organized white power. Caldwell offered a reward, $100 to the man who brought Zora back alive, $50 for her body. The men gathered in his yard, drinking his whiskey, boasting about what they would do when they found her. Their voices carrying across the fields where enslaved people listened and said nothing and knew everything. They rode out at 2 in the afternoon, 27 men in total counting Caldwell, himself, who insisted on leading the expedition personally. His pride had been wounded beyond repair by Webb's story, by the implication that he couldn't control his own property, that a girl his property had killed 4 white men and walked away unpunished. It was intolerable. It was an inversion of the natural order. It was, he believed, a challenge that if left unanswered would inspire every slave in Georgia to consider rebellion. So he rode at the front of the column, his jaw set, his rifle across his saddle, determined to restore the order that a 17-year-old girl had dared to disrupt. Silas Webb watched them go from the porch where he sat with a bottle of Caldwell's bourbon, drinking steadily, trying to drown the memory of Zora's eyes, of Cain's throat opening like a second mouth, of the way the swamp had felt alive and aware and hungry. He didn't join them. He'd been dismissed from service, Caldwell's disgust at his survival evident in every word. But Webb knew something Caldwell didn't. He'd been spared for a reason. He was meant to witness what came next. The expedition returned at dusk. 12 men, 15 were missing, including Josiah Caldwell. The survivors stumbled back on foot, having lost their horses to panic or simply abandoning them in their desperate flight from the swamp. Their clothes were torn, their faces scratched and bleeding from branches, their eyes carrying that same hollow look that Webb had seen in his own reflection. That morning, the Confederate militia captain, a man named Hargrove who had fought at Bull Run without flinching, was among them. He sat down heavily on Caldwell's front steps, his rifle gone, his uniform filthy, and when the overseer from the neighboring Clemens plantation asked what had happened, Hargrove laughed, a broken, jagged sound that held no humor whatsoever. "She was waiting for us," he said, staring at nothing. Right at the edge of the swamp, standing in broad daylight like she was welcoming guests to a Sunday social. Caldwell spurred his horse forward, shouting for the men to form a line, to surround her. But the horses wouldn't go. They reared and bucked and threw their riders or simply refused to move. So we went on foot, 27 men, armed to the teeth. He paused, accepting the whiskey bottle someone handed him, drinking deep. She didn't run, didn't even move, just stood there watching us come. And when we got within 50 yards, she turned and walked into the trees, slow, like she had all the time in the world. They followed, of course. What else could they do? To turn back would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that a slave girl held power they couldn't match. So they entered the swamp in formation, rifles ready, determined to end this insanity with bullets and rope. The trees closed around them like a mouth. The light changed, grew dim despite the afternoon sun still visible through the canopy. And one by one, men began to disappear. Not dramatically, not with screams or gunshots. They simply weren't there anymore. A man would be walking beside you, and then you'd look again and he was gone, his footprints ending mid-stride, as if he'd been plucked from existence by an invisible hand. Caldwell ordered them to stay close, to maintain formation, to fire at anything that moved. They obeyed, bunching together so tightly they could barely walk, weapons pointed in every direction. But the swamp offered no targets, just endless trees and black water and silence punctuated by the occasional sound of something large moving through the underbrush, circling them, pacing them, staying just out of sight. A young man from the Clemens plantation, no more than 19, fired at a shadow, and the gunshot echoed strangely, flat and dead, swallowed by the vegetation. The shadow moved closer. He fired. Again. And this time the rifle misfired, the cap snapping uselessly. He looked down at his weapon in confusion, and when he looked up, Zora was standing directly in front of him, so close he could have touched her. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. She simply reached out and placed one hand over his heart, and he dropped like a stone, dead before he hit the ground, his eyes still open in surprise. That's when the formation broke. Men scattered in every direction, all discipline forgotten, pure animal panic taking over. Caldwell screamed at them to hold, to stand their ground, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Captain Hargrove ran, and he wasn't ashamed to admit it now. Sitting on those steps in the dying light, he ran blindly, crashing through palmetto and vine, and behind him he heard screams, short, sharp, suddenly cut off. He heard splashes as men stumbled into the water and didn't come back up. He heard Caldwell's voice raised in fury, and then in fear, and then not at all. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, and when he finally collapsed against a tree, gasping, he realized he could hear others nearby, ragged breathing, whispered prayers, the sounds of men who had discovered their own mortality and found it terrifying. They regrouped, the 12 survivors, finding each other by voice in the gathering darkness. Caldwell was not among them. Neither were the soldiers under Hargrove's command, young men who'd survived battle only to vanish in a Georgia swamp at the hands of something they couldn't comprehend. They made it out as the last light died, emerging from the tree line like refugees from a war that had no name, no maps, no place in the official history that was already being written about the conflict tearing the nation apart. The neighboring plantation owners who had gathered at Caldwell's house, waiting for news of the expedition's triumph, fell silent as the survivors staggered into the yard. No one asked what had happened. The looks on their faces told the story clearly enough. Defeat, absolute and incomprehensible, at the hands of a single enslaved girl who had somehow tapped into something older and darker than the institution they'd built their wealth upon. Captain Hargrove gave his report in a flat, emotionless voice, the voice of a man cataloging a disaster he still couldn't fully believe. 15 men gone. Josiah Caldwell gone. The girl still in the swamp, still free, still waiting. In the quarters that night, enslaved people spoke in whispers that somehow carried more weight than shouts. They spoke Zora's name like a prayer, like a promise, like the first word of a language that had been beaten out of their mouths but never fully erased from their hearts. Children who had been born into bondage heard the story and understood for the first time that slavery was not a natural law but a human construction. And what humans built, humans could tear down. Old women who remembered Africa nodded in satisfaction, recognizing in Zora's actions the working of forces their grandmothers had taught them to respect. Young men who had learned helplessness from birth felt something stir in their chests, something dangerous and necessary and long suppressed. No. One went after Zora again. Not that week, not that month, not ever. The swamp became forbidden territory, a place white men avoided with the kind of superstitious dread they usually reserved for graveyards at midnight and houses where murders had occurred. Caldwell's plantation continued to function, managed by his widow, a hard woman made harder by loss. But the enslaved people who worked those fields moved differently now. They stood a little straighter. They looked white overseers in the eye. They had seen proof that the world could be different. Zora herself was never captured, never seen again by white eyes after that April day in 1862. Some said she died in the swamp, her body claimed by the same forces she had called upon to exact her vengeance. Others insisted she made it north, walking by night, guided by stars and intuition, and the network of brave souls who sheltered runaways on their journey to freedom. A few whispered that she never left at all, that she still walks those Georgia pines, a guardian spirit protecting those who flee through her territory, a reminder that some debts are paid in blood and some names are written in a ledger that no earthly power can erase. The truth, like most truths born in bondage and violence, was never recorded in any official document, never entered into any courthouse record, never acknowledged by those who wrote the histories that would be taught to children in generations to come, but in the quarters, in the whispered conversations passed from parent to child, from survivor to descendant, in the oral tradition that preserved what written history tried to erase, Zora lived on. She became a story told by firelight, a song hummed while working fields that weren't truly worked by choice, a name invoked when courage was needed, and justice seemed impossibly far away. She became proof that the powerless were never truly powerless, that rage could be refined into something holy, that the earth itself remembered every drop of blood spilled upon it, and sometimes, just sometimes, it chose to collect the debt. 17 years old, barefoot, armed with nothing but a razor and the accumulated grief of millions, she had carved her name into the hidden history of resistance, into the secret record of those who said no when the world demanded submission. The swamp kept her secrets, the land held her memory, and in the generations that followed, when children asked their grandparents if the stories were true, the old ones would smile and say, "Every word," and remember, some spirits never rest until the work of justice is done.